On February 3, 2023, a Norfolk Southern freight train passed two trackside heat detectors as a wheel bearing on one of its cars climbed past 250 degrees. By the time the third detector flagged it, the bearing had already failed. 38 cars came off the rails in East Palestine, Ohio. 11 of them carried hazardous materials. American trains derail less often than they did 40 years ago, but a single failure now can do far more damage than it could a generation ago. To understand why, we have to look past the crash footage and into the track, the equipment, and the business decisions that shape how American freight rail actually works. If you've watched American news at any point in the last few years, you've probably gotten the impression that the country's freight railroads are falling apart. And it's easy to see why. The images are dramatic. Tank cars on their sides, black smoke over small towns, reporters framed against twisted steel. But the numbers tell a more complicated story. In the late 1970s, U.S. railroads recorded around 10,000 derailments a year. Today, that figure is closer to 1,000. The Class 1 freight railroads that move most of the country's cargo have cut their mainline derailment rate by more than half since 2005. By the raw statistics, this is one of the safer eras in American railroading. So why does it feel worse? Well, let's look at where derailments are actually happening. About 70 to 74% of derailments happen in rail yards or on industry track, usually at lower speeds and with far less damage. A locomotive bumps a coupling, a car jumps the track, somebody fills out a form. Those don't make the news. The ones that do are the mainline incidents, the ones where a long, heavy train comes off the rails at 50 miles an hour, near a town, near a river, near a school. Those make up a small fraction of the total. They are also the ones that define the public memory of American freight rail. East Palestine in 2023, Graniteville, South Carolina in 2005, Lac-Mégantic, Quebec in 2013, all three are rare in the statistical sense, but none of them feel too rare to the towns that live through them. Most freight on a typical American train is harmless. Gravel, lumber, grain, finished cars, shipping containers stacked too high. A derailment involving any of that is expensive and inconvenient, but it stays a railroad problem. But roughly 1 in 10 freight cars carry something else. Chlorine, vinyl chloride, crude oil, liquefied petroleum gas, and hydrous ammonia. The chemistry varies, but the math is consistent. A single ruptured tank car can carry enough material to evacuate a town, contaminate a watershed, or burn for days. So the derailment rate has dropped, but the cargo on the rails has gotten more dangerous. Those two trends are what make a rare event today capable of doing damage that a more common event in 1980 simply couldn't. To understand why these derailments keep happening, the first place to look is pretty simple: the track itself. Track failure is consistently one of the biggest causes of derailment in the United States. It accounts for about 33 to 35% of derailments overall, and the failures inside that category are surprisingly old-fashioned. Broken rails, defective welds, worn ties, rail beds that shift under heavy loads, track geometry problems where the two rails drift slightly apart or out of alignment, just enough that a wheel at speed climbs over the edge instead of staying inside. And a modern freight train can weigh 19,000 tons. The contact patch between each wheel and the rail is about the size of a dime. The system works because every component along that interface stays within tight tolerances. When one of them doesn't, physics takes over fast. Consider Graniteville, South Carolina, January 2025. A Norfolk Southern train was diverted off the main line because a switch had been left in the wrong position. It collided with a parked train carrying chlorine. The tank ruptured, 9 people lost their lives from chlorine exposure, 250 were injured, 5,000 were evacuated from their homes. The cause was technically a misaligned switch, partly track infrastructure, partly human error. The deeper cause was that this was the kind of failure modern rail systems are supposed to catch and didn't. There was no signal protecting the siding. The crew that had left the switch wrong had moved on hours earlier. The small mechanical mistake, made hours earlier, sat there unnoticed until the next train came along and found it. But derailments don't just happen because of the track. Sometimes the failure is in the train itself. Roughly 25 to 27% of derailments come from the machinery itself. Overheating wheel bearings, cracked axles, broken wheels, brake systems that don't release evenly across the train, couplers that fail under tension, locomotives or rail cars with worn parts that should have been pulled from service. Which brings the story back to East Palestine. A rail car wheel bearing has a known failure curve. It heats up slowly, then it heats up fast, and then it seizes. To catch this before catastrophe, American railroads rely on a network of trackside hot bearing detectors, sensors mounted along the rails that take infrared readings of every axle as a train rolls past. When a bearing crosses a temperature threshold, an alert is supposed to reach the crew in time to stop the train. On the night of February 3rd, the failing bearing did exactly what bearings do. It heated up. The first detector recorded it warm. The second recorded it hotter. By the third, it was over the alarm threshold. The crew was told to stop. They tried, but the bearing had already failed. So, the detectors did technically work, they just hadn't been spaced closely enough to catch the failure in time. On that section of track, the sensors sat roughly 20 miles apart. A bearing in late-stage failure can go from warning temperature to seizure in less time than it takes a freight train to cover 20 miles at line speed. The next major cause is human error, the explanation people reach for first, even though it's rarely the whole story. This could be misaligned switches, improper braking on heavy grades, cars left unsecured, trains assembled in the wrong order with heavy cars in the wrong position relative to lighter ones, crews working hours of service that on paper are perfectly legal and in practice mean operating a 30,000-ton machine at 3 in the morning after a partial night of sleep. Lac-Mégantic, Quebec, July 6, 2013. A 74-car oil train was parked overnight on a downhill grade outside town. The engineer, working alone on a one-man crew, set what he believed were enough handbrakes and went off duty. Unfortunately, they weren't enough. The lead locomotive caught fire after the engineer left. The air brakes bled off, and at around 1 a.m., the train started rolling. It accelerated down the grade and entered Lac-Mégantic at 65 miles an hour. 63 tank cars derailed in the town center. The crude oil ignited, 47 people lost their lives, and most of the downtown was destroyed. 3 things stacked on top of each other to produce that night: a single crew member instead of 2, a relaxed regulatory environment that had allowed a one-man operation of hazardous trains, and a company under intense financial pressure to keep operating costs as low as possible. No single one of those would have caused the disaster alone. Together, they removed every layer of redundancy the system used to depend on. By the time the train started moving, there was nobody on board to stop it. Redundancy. That is the word the modern industry has spent 40 years engineering out. In 1980, Congress passed the Staggers Rail Act, which deregulated American freight rail. The intent was to save an industry that was financially collapsing. And it worked. Over the next 4 decades, more than 40 major railroads consolidated into a handful. The survivors became enormously profitable. Around 2017, the survivors began adopting a strategy called precision scheduled railroading. The label sounds technical, but the practice is straightforward. Run fewer, longer trains, cut the number of workers needed per train, trim inspections to the minimum the regulator will allow, and hold the schedule tight no matter what. The financial results were immediate. Operating ratios, the share of revenue eaten by operating costs, dropped to record lows. Stock prices climbed, but the side effects took longer to surface. The length of trains grew. It is now common for a single freight train to exceed 2 miles in length. A 2-mile train has different brake dynamics than a 1-mile train, more in-train forces and curves, and a higher probability that somewhere along its length, one car has a defect nobody caught at the last inspection. Workforce numbers fell. Between 2017 and 2020, the major railroads cut roughly a quarter of their employees. Carmen, the inspectors who walk trains and find defects before they leave the yard, were among the cuts. Average pre-departure inspection times dropped from about 3 minutes per car to under a minute and a half. Each individual change made the system more efficient, but stacked together, they removed the slack that used to absorb small failures before those failures became headlines. And this is where the regulatory gap matters. The detectors that were supposed to catch the East Palestine bearing failure were not governed by a federal rule on spacing or alarm thresholds. In many cases, the freight railroad companies themselves decide where the sensors are placed, how sensitive the alarms are, and when the crew is told to stop. The same pattern shows up across the system. The government regulates rail safety, but much of the day-to-day inspection burden still falls on the railroad companies themselves. So when trains get longer, workforces get smaller, and inspection windows get tighter, the question becomes simple: who is catching the problems before they leave the yard? So this is the problem that causes all these derailments. I mean, American freight rail is, by the raw numbers, safer than it was a generation ago. It also has a system that has been deliberately engineered to operate with less margin, so fewer people, longer trains, faster turnarounds, and just enough inspection to satisfy the regulator. So when something goes wrong on a system like that, there are fewer chances to catch it before it becomes a headline on the news. The trains will keep getting longer, the workforce will keep shrinking. The future of rail safety depends on whether these systems can spot the next weak point before it reaches a town, a river, or a community. If you want more breakdowns on systems that move this country and the quiet decisions that shape them, subscribe. I'm Tristan, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.